After the horrendous massacre in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, President Donald Trump visits that city to honor the victims of hate. 11 gunned down, scores injured by a heavily armed lone gunman who viciously targeted his unsuspecting victims solely because of their religion. Days earlier, fear seized the media as pipe bombs were delivered to members of the media, also targeted prominent Democrats. Meanwhile, southern American border states brace for a caravan of thousands of people seeking to come into the United States. All this less than a week before a crucial U.S. midterm election. Welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren. On today's show, less than a week before an increasingly contentious midterm election, we are taking the temperature of the nation. What is motivating voters to head to the polls? Is it merely a routine exercise of right to vote? Or is it jobs, health care, or fear for some, an intense like or an intense dislike for President Trump? And this election 2018, the question, do Americans really care who controls Congress? We're going to bring you the insight from Matt Schlapp, the chairman of the American Conservative Union, one of the largest conservative grassroots organizations in the country, and political director for former U.S. President George W. Bush, and also Martin Frost, a 26-year Texas congressman, 8 of them as a member of the House Democratic leadership. Representative Frost is also co-author of the recent book, The Partisan Divide, Congress in Crisis. We are live on Facebook at Voice America and want your comments and questions. And we are less than a week from the all-important U.S. midterm election. It could decisively shift that balance of power in the United States. And it is a week that has many Americans on edge, with President Donald Trump once again playing consoler-in-chief, paying a visit Tuesday to the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In this synagogue, 11 worshipers were massacred in the deadliest attack ever on Jews on American soil. Some family members of the victims and some city officials declined to join the president, accusing him of fostering an atmosphere that has allowed hate to flourish. Many others welcomed the president's visit. His visit to Pittsburgh comes just days after the arrest of a self-proclaimed Trump supporter who is accused of sending pipe bombs to more than a dozen prominent Democrats and news organizations. VOA national correspondent Jim Malone takes a look at the election homestretch in what is quickly becoming one of the most contentious and most expensive midterm elections in U.S. history.
In Pittsburgh, a tearful vigil for the victims of the mass shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue. From President Trump, a condemnation of violence and a plea for unity.
We condemn the historic evil of anti-Semitism and every other form of evil. And unfortunately, evil comes in many forms. And we come together as one American people.
The synagogue shooting and the arrest of a man charged with sending pipe bombs to prominent Democrats and Trump critics have heightened tensions and uncertainty in the final days of the midterm campaign, says analyst John Hudak.
Well, the country is in pain. This is a set of circumstances that unfortunately happens in America all too regularly. That is, acts of violence and acts of aggression toward fellow Americans by Americans.
Hey, folks, how are you?
Former Vice President Joe Biden is among those calling for calm.
I know sometimes these days the anger, the hatred, the viciousness seem like they're going to overwhelm us. And it's on our leaders to set the tone, to dial down the temperature, to restore some dignity to our national dialogue.
A vote for Democrats is also a vote to destroy Medicare.
Some Democrats say the president's partisan attacks have contributed to the politically charged atmosphere. Not true, says White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders.
The very first thing the media did was blame the president and make him responsible for these ridiculous acts. That is outrageous that would be the very first reaction.
For his part, Trump has vowed to campaign aggressively right up to Election Day on issues important to his supporters, like immigration.
The Democrat Party is openly encouraging millions of illegal aliens to break our laws, violate our borders, and bankrupt our country. That's what has to happen.
I did 50 town halls. You know what people talked about in those town halls? Health care.
Democrats have focused on health care for much of the campaign, but Trump also looms large, says Jim Kessler.
Democrats want to make this about health care and the tax bill and about Donald Trump. And let's face it, this is going to be about Donald Trump.
You all ready?
Democrats expect to make gains in the House of Representatives, but Republicans are favored to hold their narrow majority in the Senate, says John Fortier.
And some of what has happened in recent days with the Kavanaugh hearings and Republicans kind of coming home as a party are helping in that area. So it'll be mostly a win for Democrats, but with a probably bright spot in the Senate for Republicans.
The stakes are enormous. A Democratic House could block the Trump agenda and launch numerous investigations of the Trump White House, complicating the president's re-election hopes in 2020. Jim Malone, VOA News, Washington.
And Jim Malone joins me to talk about what is at stake for both U.S. political parties. All right, Jim, how nervous should the Republicans be?
I think fairly nervous. It's been, by all indications so far, trending as a Democratic year. The question is how big of a wave may be building. Democrats feel good about gaining seats in the House, perhaps enough to take the majority. The Senate is tougher because most of the key races are Democrats defending Senate seats in Republican states, particularly states where the president did well in 2016. So they have a little more security feeling about that. But if it's an unexpectedly big wave, the outcome can be hard to predict.
All right, I think the Democrats need 23 seats in order to take over the House. Could it be as high as 33, 43? I mean, could it be that much of a political bloodbath?
Well, you know, if you look back through history, the president's not only running against his low approvals and Democrats, he's running against history, because the history of the midterms is bad news for the president's party. On average, especially if the president's approval rating is below 50%, which the president's is, you can lose, on average, 30 or so seats. So that would be enough, certainly, to give the Democrats the majority. And don't forget, there are 25 seats that were won by Hillary Clinton, districts in 2016, where a Republican is the congressperson at the moment.
All right, you mentioned Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. In 2016, all the polls were indicating most people thought she would win. So naturally, people were quite shocked when President Trump won. Is there any chance, or is there any likelihood that that same sort of shock? People are predicting the Republicans are going to lose the House, but could it be a shock?
The national polls in 2016 were pretty spot on. It was a 2 or 3 point Clinton lead. That's what happened in the national vote. Where they were off was in certain key states, and that's something to look for. Look at places like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, the results there. That will also tell us a lot about the upcoming 2020 race, because that's places where the president broke through in 2016, the so-called Democratic blue wall.
All right, well, the president has hit in the trail. He's been out a number of times having rallies. He's going to go to, I think, 8 states in the next few days between now and the election on Tuesday, and there are going to be 11 campaign rallies. How effective is he as campaigner-in-chief? Because presidents have always done this.
Yes, well, they have, and he is really focused on bringing out his base. The long-term question is, should he broaden his appeal? We'll discuss that after the election, perhaps. But the focus will be definitely on immigration. He wants to keep it there, and on keeping Republican control of the Senate. They're less focused right now on trying to maintain that majority in the House, it seems. They're really focused on a few key Senate races where they could hold the majority for the next 2 years of the Trump presidency.
All right, well, the topic always is voter turnout, which of course makes sense because voter turnout means votes. 2 or 3 weeks ago, everyone thought that what was going to drive voters to the polls was going to be the very hotly contested Justice Kavanaugh confirmation hearing. Has that sort of moved down the radar screen in terms of...
that was supposed to help Republicans. It may in the end, particularly in a few Senate races. But the story of 2018 so far has been the Democratic turnout ginned up in primaries and special elections. That's expected to continue. The question is, have Republicans been able to catch up much on the turnout fever? We will see. And for both parties, really, we talk about health care, immigration, jobs, economy, but also President Trump looms large for both parties. He is a great motivator for his base, but he also can motivate his opponents.
The last week has been extremely difficult in this country.
Yes.
The pipe bombs that they didn't explode, but they sent to members of the media, numbered prominent Democrats, and then, of course, the massacre in Pittsburgh. And people are suggesting that that's going to have an influence on the vote. But there's something called early voting in this country. So a lot of people have voted before this, right?
Well, increasingly early voting is a thing around the country. And that tends to be more, I would say, slightly trends for Republicans who are sort of dedicated. They get out and they vote early. The question we don't know is what this atmosphere in the country the last several days, how this will impact the election. One thing it has done, it's taken the focus off the issues in the sense the president wanted to focus on, which was immigration and the caravan. He is going to try to get back to that now very quickly.
All right, you've covered politics forever. What race is good? What's the one got your most attention? What's the most fascinating race, do you think?
Look at the Senate races in Indiana, in Missouri, I think, and the governor's race, say, in Wisconsin, your home state, to see where the indications are. That'll tell us a lot, not only about where the country's at this year, but what the president's prospects for re-election might be in 2020.
All right, well, it's always very exciting. This one seems particularly exciting, this midterm election. Jim, thank you.
You're welcome.
As we head into this midterm election, what is the mood among American voters? The Gallup poll says voter excitement is up. But if you look at past turnouts at midterm elections, if it's any indication, probably excitement is not up by that much. The United States trails behind most developed countries in voter turnout. According to a nonpartisan think tank, Pew Research Center, Belgium sits at the top of the list with 87% of its registered voters casting ballots in their elections. Sweden is in second place with 82% voting. Canada is below Australia, South Korea, and Israel. It's in 20th spot with only 62% of eligible Canadian voters voting in their national elections. And the United States? Well, it falls 6 spots behind Canada. The United States is in 26th place, near the bottom, with only 55% of American registered voters casting ballots in the 2016 election, just slightly ahead of Poland and Luxembourg. And of course, 2016 was a presidential election year when voter turnout in the United States is traditionally at its highest. Right now, Republicans have the White House and control both the House and the Senate, but that could change, as Jim Malone says, come election day. And if that does, that would be big, big, big news here in the United States. The latest polls are suggesting Republicans could lose majority control of the House. This is because Republicans have more seats up for grabs in areas where Democrats appear to be gaining voters. But some argue the race is much closer than we think, and we have seen that polls have been wrong in the past. The sizzling question is this: how much does it matter which party controls Congress? Here's VOA's Marcus Harton on what a congressional majority of either political party means for American voters.
Republicans now control the presidency and both houses of Congress. They can pass legislation without support from the Democratic Party. They also perform legislative oversight over the executive branch, their party's president and his administration. Things would change if the midterm elections put Democrats in control of either house of Congress. If Democrats win, the Trump administration's legislative agenda could slow or stop. Immigration reform, border security, health care, and social programs are in the balance. A Democratic majority would have oversight of the Trump administration. They would decide the targets of congressional investigations. They would have subpoena power to force administration testimony. In the midterm, many U.S. states will hold elections for governor and legislators. In most states, the winners will use 2020 census data to redraw legislative districts. Boundaries formed to the benefit of the party in power will influence elections for the coming decade.
With everything that has happened in just last week and with the important election just days away, the focus is on, of course, voter turnout. Who will get more voters to turn out, Republicans or Democrats? And what issues are driving voters to the polls? Joining us to discuss that is what's on the mind of conservative voters is Matt Schlapp, current chairman of the American Conservative Union and former political advisor to former President George W. Bush. Nice to see you, Matt.
Great to be with you, Greta.
All right, Matt, first, the incidents this last week, obviously all over the media radar screen. What's the impact, do you think, on conservative voters?
You mean on these tragedies and the pipe bombs and the shooting in Pennsylvania.
I mean, I don't mean what's the impact. I mean, does that drive voters to the polls?
I think it makes Americans who are already concerned about the state of things in America even more concerned. I'm not so sure that benefits one party or the other, but I do think there's an angst about whether or not Americans can kind of keep it together and have political disagreements without there being violence.
Is this election midterm for the Republican Party, is this a referendum on the president and sort of give us a prediction of what's to come in 2020?
I don't think the White House loves it when I say this, but it can't help but be a referendum on the president because he looms so large over our politics. He dominates every news cycle. So he's not going to be the major player in each and every race. But overall, at the end of the night, there's no question that the voters are in some ways saying what they think about Donald Trump as well.
You know, it's interesting. Everyone talks about this horrible past week with the massacre and also with the pipe bombs that didn't go off as having influence on the vote. I'm less inclined to think that drives voters out because it does cross both party lines. It affects Democrats and Republicans alike. And also because there's early voting. Some people voted before, but also the old adage that all politics is local. And you have that important race down in the state of Florida between Governor Scott and Senator Bill Nelson for that seat.
Yeah.
And you've got an issue like red tide, which is totally an interest that's consuming the voters in Florida, but not someplace else.
That's exactly right. So it's easy to mischaracterize or characterize an election cycle over a couple of dominant national issues. But a lot of times it comes down to the quality of the candidate. Like I look at that Senate race in Missouri, I look at Josh Hawley. He's young, he's energetic, he's a really smart guy, he's a great candidate. Claire McCaskill, I would say not so much so. So it depends also on how you match up to your opponent. Trump versus Clinton was a classic of that. So even though issues dominate things and local issues, like you're saying in Florida, it's true, red tide is having a big impact on the race. There's a lot of interesting dynamics to the people who are running, and that impacts races.
All right. Our audience is an international audience.
Yeah.
People watch this all over the world. What do you think, why should this matter? Or what impact would this have on the people who might be watching in Iran?
Well, what I would say is the following. When America is strong, and I don't mean militarily strong, projecting strength militarily. I mean when America is a strong economy and American society is strong, it's actually good for the globe. That's what peace through strength was all about with Ronald Reagan. A growing and prospering America is good for everybody because let's face it, we help in almost every corner of the globe, even just with humanitarian aid. We're the dominant player on so many of those questions about human rights and people's ability to just get the basic staples in life. So if America's doing well, it's good for the globe, and America's doing well.
But are you suggesting if the House, just one part of the government, the House, goes Democrat, that's sort of putting a sort of a strain on the Trump agenda. But is that going to change things dramatically?
Not because, as you remember, it takes a supermajority in the Senate. So Trump hasn't had that supermajority in the Senate. So he's only been able to do certain things legislatively, like pass a budget. In the end, it's been a lot of executive actions and the rollback of regulations. And that's what's got this economy humming.
Does this have any impact on China? People in China watching this?
Yeah, it has an impact in the sense that it's a way for them they're doing all kinds of intelligence in our country. That's a nice way of saying it. But they're trying to figure, the government of China anyway, is trying to figure out, okay, what's going on with this Trump aggressive agenda on China? Will the president continue to push back on the government of China with these trade actions? And I think no matter what happens in this election, that's going to happen. But the American people are also going to have a chance to weigh in and say, do they like that new approach? I think they do.
Well, typically, foreign policy has been sort of bipartisan. It's where we're a little bit more on the same page, Republicans and Democrats. Not so much, it doesn't seem, with this president.
Yeah, I'd say that's actually been true for a while. After September 11th, I served in the White House then. There did seem to be a bipartisan approach to how we were going to handle extremism and terrorism. And there's no question that has definitely broken down. It's one of the things I'd like to see us get back as a country. But Donald Trump isn't going to do that in any other way but being bold about what his policy objectives are. Like, what he's done with stopping the Iran nuclear deal, moving the embassy in Jerusalem in the Middle East. It's controversial. But in the end, if something like that can't be bipartisan in America, maybe bipartisanship is over in foreign policy.
Well, that's going to be fascinating to see what happens next week. Matt, thank you.
Thanks, Greta.
And less than a week before the election, President Trump is once again floating the idea of ending birthright citizenship. Now, birthright citizenship means if you were born on U.S. soil, you are automatically an American citizen. The U.S. Constitution identifies that right, but President Trump says he can issue an executive order eliminating that birthright. Many, if not most, dispute that a president has that right. Republican Speaker of the House Paul Ryan disputes that the president has that power. And should President Trump issue that order, there will be, of course, a huge legal fight. All this as U.S. states brace for what some are calling an invasion and others are calling a humanitarian crisis of Central American people. VOA's Elizabeth Lee went to the border between the United States and Mexico to speak to the people on both sides of the fence.
The community of San Isidro is home of the busiest land border crossing in the Western Hemisphere.
Tourists coming from Tijuana, people who come to work from Tijuana, but they have papers.
15 minutes away at another border crossing, Rosie Lerma can be found working at this restaurant, Mi Ranchito.
Yeah, I have family in Tijuana. My mom lives there. Yeah, I go to see my mom like twice a week. She's kind of sick and old.
When she heard news of more than 5,200 troops coming to the southwest border,
I don't see the point on that, because nothing happens here. We don't see like illegals or bad things happening here.
The reason for the troops is the caravan of Central American migrants making their way northward. President Trump says gang members and bad people are mixed in with the caravan and described it as an invasion of the U.S.
Due to the large size of the potential caravans that may arrive at the border, however, the Department of Homeland Security has further requested the support of the Department of Defense.
Enrique Morones founded Border Angels, an organization for migrants.
It's really a message of hate. We're not at war. These two countries are not at war.
I don't think that all those who are coming on the caravan are bad. They're looking for the American dream, more stability, in other words, a better life.
Organizations that help migrants are preparing if the caravan comes here.
We're all on high alert, realizing that this could happen.
The Christ United Methodist Ministry Center is already providing temporary shelter, clothing, and food for some of the people who have been stopped by Border Patrol, processed, and released into the U.S.
They are detainees who are being tracked by ankle bracelets. They don't have money, so a lot of them don't have a means to go anywhere. They're waiting to get communication with their family members who are trying to purchase tickets for them.
And that volunteers' reaction to more troops at the border?
I'm a voter. I have a power through that vote, and everyone else does too.
The military presence will only be able to support Border Patrol with duties such as planning, medical support, and any construction of temporary housing. Elizabeth Lee, VOA News, San Diego.
The rhetoric versus the reality of caravans and border security are conversations that could animate some voters in the midterm election. But for a look at what's important to Democratic voters, we are joined by former Texas Congressman Martin Frost, a 26-year Democratic lawmaker, 8 of them as a member of the House Democratic leadership. Nice to see you, sir.
Good to see you.
Obviously, the immigration issue is hugely important. It's getting a lot of attention in the media. Very important to the border states, Texas, California, and Arizona. Do you think, though, overall, in sort of the race for the Democrats to get out the vote, that that's one of the driving forces to get to the polls across the country?
It's hard to read that, particularly since what the president is saying is totally unrealistic at this point. The caravan, however number of people there are, is not going to even get to our border for a month or two. They're moving very slowly. We don't know how many people there are. There are people seeking asylum. The most recent pronouncement by the president that he's going to use an executive order, attempt to use an executive order, to overrule a provision in our Constitution is generally viewed by lawyers on both sides as nonsense. In fact, George Conway, the husband of the president's advisor, Kellyanne Conway, has an article in today's Washington Post saying this is unconstitutional. I think the president is trying to make a lot of noise. I think the public cares about what's happening on issues that directly affect them right now. I think the health care issue is very important for Democrats because Republicans have tried to repeal Obamacare, including eliminating the protection for people with pre-existing conditions. I think these races are going to be, for the House, are going to be decided largely on local issues in those particular districts, whether the incumbent is someone who's been strongly supporting the president or whether they want someone more independent. I think the Democrats are going to take the House. I would suggest to your viewers, and I know this is they're around the world, when the results start coming in, They may even want to look at the results from the eastern seaboard of the United States, eastern time zone. There are a number of contested races there, and that'll give you an indication of how many seats the Democrats are going to pick up.
All right, it's a very serious election, as they all are, but it's also fascinating.
Yeah.
Which race has captivated your attention the most?
Well, I was chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, so I focused on House races. The Senate races are higher profile, and for example, I've been supporting a woman, a retired Marine aviator who's running for Congress in Kentucky, Amy McGrath, who's running a very strong campaign against just a bland Republican incumbent. There are other races like that around the country. I think for the Senate races, and that's what most of your viewers will focus on, you want to look at Missouri. Claire McCaskill, she's a very tough campaigner. She's had a couple of tough campaigns. She's won. You want to look at some other states to see the Republicans probably will hold on to the Senate. They probably will lose the House. In the last 100 years, there have only been 3 times in which the president's party has not lost seats in a congressional election after he's been elected. One was in 34 when Roosevelt, the second was when I was chairman of the DCCC in 98, and the third was when my co-author of the book we wrote on Congress, Tom Davis, was chairman of the Republican Campaign Committee. They're going to lose seats in the House. The question is how many.
This president has gotten us out of the Iran deal that the Democratic president, President Obama, brought us. Does this election have any impact on Iran? If let's assume that the Republicans lose the House, they don't lose the Senate, and of course the White House isn't even up for grabs. Does this impact the people of Iran in any way?
I would be surprised if it does. The president generally can conduct foreign policy for our country. There are certain limits. We've had in the past, we've had a policy that politics stops at the water's edge and that you deal with these on a bipartisan issue. I think China is more interesting, and also some of our dealings with the rest of Western Europe is more interesting.
Why would they be interested in this race?
Well, because the president has done some pretty outrageous things in terms of trade, of imposing tariffs on imports from certain countries. China has reacted in their own interest.
But does changing the House impact those?
Oh, I think it could, because I think the House will call in officials of the government and say, explain now, why are these tariffs good for farmers in the United States? It looks like they're not. It looks like China is retaliating. Also, our relationship with Europe has been fundamental to us as a country. And I think U.S. officials will have to come in and justify what the president's doing.
There's been some saber-rattling by some Democrats that in the event that the House goes Democrat, that Democrats want to start impeachment proceedings against the president. Is that a political talk, or is that a reality?
I don't think you can make a judgment on that right now. We wait till the Mueller report comes in. I think there'll be some people who will want to bring impeachment charges in the House. That's by majority vote. But remember, to actually remove the president, you have to have a 2/3 vote of the Senate. This president's not going to be removed by the United States Senate, barring something very unusual in the Mueller report. I'm not even sure that impeachment charges will actually be voted on in the House.
Congressman, nice to see you, sir. It'll be interesting what happens next Tuesday. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Before we go, I want to update you on a story that we've been following very closely. The 2 Reuters journalists in Myanmar who were sentenced to a 7-year prison term for investigating the massacre of 10 Rohingya Muslims during a bloody military crackdown, they are ready to file an appeal. Now, their appeal process could take up to 6 months, leaving the 2 reporters in prison for at least that long, assuming they win. If they lose, the 7-year prison term stands. There is evidence the reporters were set up. Myanmar's civilian leader, Nobel Peace Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi, once considered Myanmar's moral leader, has refused to intervene even though her government has the power to drop the charges and set these 2 reporters free. That's all the time we have for today. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice America. You can also like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta. And do follow me on Twitter @Greta. Thank you for being plugged in.